Hey class, so here's what we're talking about today. It's the Renaissance. This should be the third set in your notes. What we're going to be looking at is essentially there was the dark times, the Middle Ages where it was like not so great, and then the Renaissance is the rebirth where we're coming back to life. People are becoming smarter, people are investing tons of money in art and culture and history and all these kinds of things. So we're going to take a look at where this came from and how it got started. Everything you need is going to be highlighted in yellow, so make sure that you write it down in your notebook. Also, I would say if I'm going too fast, just pause it, take your time. I'm making this guy for you guys, so yeah. Here we go. So the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople is an ancient city. So here's the deal. It is basically modern-day Istanbul. It's in Turkey. What's going on is it's kind of like halfway between Asia and halfway between Europe. So what we're doing here is it's a middleman, right? It's like a car dealership. They don't make the cars, they just take them and then sell them, right? So it's kind of like they're taking the spices from Asia and then they're selling them to European traders that come by. So what they're doing is they're making lots and lots of money being the middleman between Asia and Europe, these two huge markets. The Europeans, like the French, the English, the Spanish, they want to buy these spices and these goods, silk, and all these really desirable resources are only available from Asia. So what happens is they decide, okay, let's go ahead, let's purchase them through Constantinople. So Constantinople is in a great geographic location. It has a harbor, which allows for shipping. It's just a fantastic little spot. So for the longest time, Constantinople makes tons and tons of money by being a middleman. You have to look at what was going on before the Renaissance, and you had the Middle Ages, right? These are, kind of dark times. It's kind of like if you've ever seen Robin Hood. It's this sort of time period. So you have people who are, serving as peasants in a kingdom. They're basically working their farms, and a good portion of their money is actually going up to the kings. You have knights running around. You have lords and nobles and all these kinds of people. And they're all part of this system called feudalism. So feudalism is essentially this pyramid system that you're looking at here over there. And it's essentially designed to keep the peasants safe, but also make money for the king. So it's a pyramid structure that everybody kind of benefits from, but there's not a lot of mobility. You can't really go from being a peasant to being a king. It just doesn't happen, no matter what you see in the movies. So there's not a lot of freedom here, right? It also combined the ideas of land ownership and service in the military. So the king says, listen, if you want to own some land, if you want to become a lord, maybe if you want to have serfs or have people that are under your protection, I'll give it to you in exchange for some military service. So this is one way that kings would raise armies in order to help support themselves. This was a time period when countries were invading each other, when kings were trying to conquer more and more land. And so having an army that was loyal to you and having an army that was ready to go was super advantageous. So what happens is this system works fine for a while. But we start to get to the 1300s and things start to fall apart. And part of the reason that the system starts to fall apart is because of something called the bubonic plague. So what essentially happens is the plague somewhere around 1346, 1347 somehow spreads from Asia over to Europe and people start dying. So the plague originated somewhere in Asia, and this disease that was carried by rats on cargo ships came over into Europe and started to spread like wildfire. So Asia, these small towns in China were having problems with the plague, and it was spreading and killing everyone. But somehow these diseases were now coming over to continental Europe, where the population was very dense, things were not super hygienic, and so the plague starts to spread like crazy. It's thought that originally it came in through Italy, but before you know it, 1/3 of the entire population of Europe was dead. So the unintended consequences of this is it basically weakens the feudal system. There's now an extreme demand for jobs. So you have this problem where we have this system that requires lots and lots of peasants. Well, millions and millions of peasants just died. So the system sort of gets upended. And what sort of rises in its place is the system that we kind of have today, where jobs are available and people will pay wages in order to get the best employee. Well, if there's not a lot of workers, you might have to pay a higher wage in order to get that. The other unintended consequence of the plague is that people believe strongly in the Catholic Church. The Pope is seen as like one of the highest authorities in the world. So you look at people praying and begging for the plague to stop. Spare my children, spare my wife, spare my husband. But unfortunately, despite no matter, how often they go to church or how much they pray, you just can't pray away the plague. And so people's faith in Christianity starts to become shaken. And this would be important later on when the Reformation starts to come about, because there would be questioning of the Catholic Church. People prior to that sort of believed that the Church knew all. And in fact, their faith was tested during this time period. Land ownership became not the only way to measure wealth anymore. There now were people who were getting jobs and who were making quite a bit of money because the number of people that possibly could be employed had dropped so dramatically. And so what happens with this system is, because there are less people applying for jobs, the employers have to pay more money to get people to actually work there. So, for example, let's say you are looking at a job like a trash collector, right? It might not be the most glamorous job. There might be 10 people that want to apply for that job. Well, if a plague comes through and kills, 6 of them, now there's only 4 people that might apply for that job. And so, in order to get more people to apply for those jobs, the company that's in charge of collecting the trash is going to have to raise wages to try to attract more people. So it really does benefit workers in sort of a perverse way, because there are less people, there's less competition for jobs. So the odds of you getting hired and the odds of you getting a higher salary go up. Italian banking. The Italians also became very, very wealthy during the Renaissance. Just like with Constantinople, Italy was this place where these merchants would sort of come into Florence, or they would come into these other port cities, and they would drop off all kinds of goods from Asia. And then the people there in Italy would purchase them, and they could sell them to the rest of Europe. So eventually Italy became one of these massive trading hubs that was sort of like the middleman between continental Europe and Asia. It also had a great advantage of becoming one of the first banking centers. People didn't want to necessarily carry goods all the time. If you came from Asia and you dropped off a ton of silk, you don't want to have to trade it for cheese or something. You want to actually get something that can be useful back home and that will make those long trips. So gold becomes really important. People start storing it in banks. You have banknotes, you have silver, you have rare gems. All these kinds of things become super, super important. So there's a family called the Medici family, which actually opened Europe's largest bank in the 1400s. So it became super influential. And the Medici family becomes super powerful, but they have all this free time because they're super rich. So they start thinking to themselves, what can we do to actually keep ourselves entertained? If you didn't have to work every day, what would you do? So they decide, let's have some entertainment. Let's write some plays. Let's read some books. Let's have some art. Ooh, we could have statues made of ourselves. All these kinds of things. So they actually became a great patron of the arts. They started to basically pay artists to do things. So everybody doesn't have to be a farmer, because now new jobs are opening up. They need writers, they need actors, they need sculptors, they need musicians. So all these new jobs start showing up, and people say, hey, this actually seems like a pretty decent career path. If you get some wealthy patron to sponsor you, you can do something fun, and you're not having to sit and work in the fields all day. So the Medici family, they were partially known for helping the revival of Greek and Roman architecture. These ideas from Greece and Rome, tragedies and comedies, they started to come back when these plays were being written. So a lot of the classics sort of became new again. You see the same sort of thing today. A lot of the plays from the 1600s are being just sort of remade into movies in the 2000s. A perfect example would be The Lion King. It's essentially the story of Hamlet. It's just redone over and over. So everything that's old is new again. The Medici family, in addition to having their own TV show on Amazon Prime about them, they actually had 4 children become popes. So you had Leo, Clement, Pius, and Leon. And so this basically royal family who was super, super wealthy now had power in the church too. So talk about a powerful group of people. You can see here on this map, goods would basically come from the Middle East. They'd come from North Africa, and they would be transported by water into Italy, where they would basically, from there, go into continental Europe to be sold. Here's a group of famous Renaissance artists. I bet Renaissance artists, who you probably know as a party dude, was Michelangelo. So Michelangelo was an artist. He was a sculptor. He was very, very famous, and a lot of his works can be found in Florence, Italy, even today. So what we're looking at here is the sculpture of David. It's essentially supposed to be a celebration of human strength and of the human body. The sculpture of David is considered one of the classic works of art. He was famous for painting the Sistine Chapel. I'm going to insert a couple of clips here of the Sistine Chapel, or a couple of photos at least. There were also some important sculptures that he made. So, for example, you had the Virgin Mary holding Jesus after he died. This is all just gorgeous sculpture work. You also had Raphael. Again, he was one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but he was a Renaissance painter. You can see here's the Madonna and Child. He also painted one called The School of Athens, which was a 1510 masterpiece where Plato is walking with Aristotle, so these 2 Greek philosophers. It's painted with a fresco, which is a type of art painted on damp plaster, typically on walls. So it's very difficult. It's very intricate work, but Raphael was one of the masters when it comes to paint. You have Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo da Vinci, just like in Ninja Turtles, he's kind of the leader of the group. Leonardo da Vinci was also considered like a true Renaissance man because he did so much. His talents went beyond art. He was a scientist, he was an inventor, he was a sculptor, he was a writer. But he's probably most well known for a little painting that he did that you might have heard of. It's called the Mona Lisa. It's actually very, very small. So if you ever go visit the Louvre in Paris, which is this art museum, the Mona Lisa is there, and it's very, very small. He was also famous for painting Jesus' Last Supper before he is eventually betrayed by Judas and killed. In addition to that, he created all kinds of ideas. He created ideas like the flying machine. He had sculptures. He had drawings of the human body. He had this idea of the perfect human body. Da Vinci also created the Vitruvian Man, which is this drawing where a man is basically stretching out his arms. It's observing like these mathematical principles about the human body. One that was really interesting is like your wingspan and your actual height are super, super close, if not the same. So he's observing all these things about the human body, which he just finds beautiful. And so they're showing up a lot in his art. A lot of the actual drawings that Da Vinci made of the human body, like arms and legs and muscle tendons and these types of things, were extremely accurate, despite the fact that he didn't know what was underneath it. He was mostly guessing and making observations from what he could see on his own body. So these drawings were extremely useful for doctors and physicians, and they were often used in medical textbooks until we had more modern examples. But if you've ever seen a book like Grey's Anatomy, it was a book before it was a TV show. If you've ever seen a book like Grey's Anatomy, there are lots of drawings that are really similar to what Da Vinci created, 500 years ago. Donatello, the last of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, he was a sculptor. He worked often with stone, and again, he was influenced heavily by historical figures and by biblical figures. And so you can see here is a sculpture of David with a sword. Niccolo Machiavelli. He is an Italian diplomat and a writer who was often referred to as the creator of political science. So he was the first one who started to think about politics in a scientific way. He wrote a book in 1513 that was known as The Prince. So he explained that a leader must rule harshly in order to keep order, right? You might be loved, you might be hated, but if you rule in a harsh way, people will respect your authority. So he said, essentially, and this is often how The Prince is justified, that the work is summarized as the ends justify the means, right? You do what you have to in order to get the result that you need. It might not be pretty, but that's what needs to be done. Actually, one little fun fact here is that Tupac Shakur, who you might know, was actually in prison when he was younger, and he read the book The Prince, and it inspired him when he came out to become the rapper, Tupac, but sometimes he rapped underneath the name Machiavelli, so he was inspired by this writer. William Shakespeare, I'm sure you've heard of William Shakespeare. In every English class, from middle school to high school to college, you study Shakespeare. Shakespeare was oftentimes rewriting the classics from the Greeks and the Romans, these comedies and tragedies. But Shakespeare becomes super, super famous during this time period. He actually had his own theater, kind of, in London. It was called the Globe Theater. You can visit a version of it today that still exists. It has had fires throughout the years and those types of things. Shakespeare had tons of plays that were super famous, and you could see shows all throughout the country and eventually all throughout the world. So plays like Romeo and Juliet, plays like Hamlet, Othello, The Merchant of Venice, The Tempest. These plays became extremely popular, and Shakespeare became one of the most famous English playwrights ever. Shakespeare is also famous for writing a play known as the Scottish play, because it's supposed to be cursed. It's called Macbeth, and it's pretty interesting. You will read that in high school. A lot of his plays are extremely quotable, and Macbeth is one example. Miguel de Cervantes. So Miguel de Cervantes was a Spanish writer who was famous for a lot of different books, but he really became like a super famous writer for his book known as El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha, or most people just call it Don Quixote. And it's a story about a man on his horse fighting windmills, but it turns out there's some humorous twists in there. Dante Alighieri was an Italian poet who became famous for writing the Divine Comedy. It was a book that had 3 parts. The first was the Inferno, so it's basically like hell. You had Purgatorio, which is purgatory, and you had Paradiso, which is heaven. So he is writing this hypothetical book where he's imagining the 7 rings of hell, the 7 layers of hell. He's imagining what purgatory must be like. He's imagining what heaven must be like. And so these poetic works became extremely famous. Oftentimes in college, if you have a world civics class or classes on religion, you'll often read these. It was an intellectual movement that focused on nature, that focused on man, that focused on earth, things that we could observe and see. So a lot of the previous works of the Renaissance were focused on the church. They were focused on Jesus. They were focused on Mary. They were focused on these religious beliefs. And so what happens now is, as the Renaissance starts to take place, we have all these artists and writers and sculptors and actors who start to look at things that they can see in front of them more rather than up. And so what they're doing is they're, painting things like parks and the skyline at night. They're acting out plays about people's lives here on Earth. They're basically changing the way that they think in order to make a lot of their work more relatable. So instead of everything being focused on religion, usually Jesus and Christianity, it's now becoming a much broader scope of what they're actually creating content about. It starts to inspire free and creative thought, which the church really wasn't up for, right? The church had been funding most of the art before. They had been the ones responsible for a lot of the songs written, a lot of the paintings done, a lot of the sculptures, and so they were very strict on what they wanted. And now with these outside influences like the Medici family and these other art patrons, now art wasn't just about religion, and it started to expand to these much larger fields. So suddenly, things get a lot more interesting. Okay. So that's pretty much going to do it for this set of notes about the Renaissance. We will be doing more on the Renaissance. It's not just one set of notes. And we will be looking eventually at the Reformation, how the Catholic Church does split into a couple of pieces. Anyways, that's going to do it for your notes. So hopefully you liked it, or maybe you loved it. I don't really know. Thumbs up and subscribe. I guess.